Well, this is a little bit of the content that I'm going to be covering. I'm going to cover a brief history of the poorhouses in the United States, in Kentucky, and in Madison County. The location of the poorhouses in the state, some of them in their various names. How the poorhouses came to be funded by state county funding. People who were associated with the poorhouse here in Madison County. Changes over time, some of the unknowns, and there's a lot of unknowns, and memories of individuals who lived near or visited the poorhouse. And then thank yous to people who have been very helpful in research. We're here to this closer to. You don't have to answer for it? I don't care to advance, right? Okay. Yeah, I could just down there. Yeah, just, okay, you just glance at me when you're ready. You're gonna hit that one first? Yeah, that. Okay. Okay. The hometowns or the poorhouses, really starting way back in the 17th century. And they were known originally as workhouses. Often they were really just cottages or shacks and crude buildings. There were crowded conditions. Oftentimes they were said to have poor food, poor shelter overall in the sanitary conditions. When people came to the United States, they started building poorhouses, and the poorhouses were actually developed up in the New England area. Certainly that would make sense, but people who lived there were expected to work regardless of what their conditions were, physically or mentally, in some way incapacitated, or whether they could just do something around the house. Courthouses were often considered punishment for people who were poor. The first poorhouse was established in Boston in 1660. There was a vending system, which actually was where poor people were auctioned off to go to other people's houses and farms and enjoy. And I think that was something that people thought there was a lot of social stigma that was associated with it. And those were often outside of public use. They were put on the back of communities away from busy lease things. This is something I learned. You know, Anne Sullivan, known as the miracle worker, Helen Keller, was sent to the poorhouse at the age of 8. Her father died, but didn't really have good conditions to live in. And so she and her brother and mother were sent to the poorhouse. And she made a statement that poorhouses were considered a crime against childhood. And there's been an extensive amount of information that I found just recently about her living in the poorhouse and how she became acquainted, or Helen Keller became acquainted with her, and how she moved on to do the work she did. Sorry. And a doubt of life, or eternity for that matter, is long enough to erase the arrows and ugly blots scored on my brain by these dismal years. And you have to remember, this was a long time ago. The poorhouses over the years, some of them changed, some of them became much better, probably in the days that Annie lived in. Poorhouses were often developed into poor farms. And those people who were able, according to research, were identified as people who worked the poor farms. They were leased out to farmers in the community expected to work and sort of earn their living. Some of them were located near railroad tracks. And one of the things that I read was that railroad workers, if they were without a job, they didn't have a place to live, they would come and live in a poorhouse that was near the railroad tracks. So they were kind of, I guess what people then call hobos, because they moved from poorhouse to poorhouse, got a job when they could, and worked, and then came back to another poorhouse, depending on where they were based on the railroad work. The poorhouses tend to start declining after the Great Depression, because there were other social programs and resources available to the poor. Most of them closed in the 30s, around the 40s. Some remained open until the 1970s, which is the case here in Madison County, and I'll talk about that. In 1910, there were 84,000 paupers. This is the name that was given people who lived in the poorhouse. And that number had increased from 1904. You're going to see the term paupers and inmates. Those were the two terms that were used for people that lived in the poorhouses. This is in Kentucky. In 10, there are 1,522 individuals housed in poorhouses. 871 males, 651. As you can see, the numbers. What I found interesting was that of the people that lived there, immigrants were mostly from Irish and Swiss descent. I cannot explain that other than, the Irish, when they migrated to the United States, many of them were very poor, did not have relatives here, or relatives did not stay close together, and so they didn't have places to stay. The poorhouses so became known as infirmaries. Now, how this came about, I've not been able to locate exactly where that change occurred. But in Madison County, it started out with the name of poorhouse, and then it was changed to the Madison County Infirmary. The other name eventually came to be known as. About 100 counties had poorhouses across the state. Most people admitted were considered unskilled laborers, but people who went to the poorhouse who were considered skilled laborers, of the men, there were carpenters, brick makers, bricklayers, and railroad workers. And railroad workers could be everything from people who brakemen and conductors to engineers on the railroads. Women who were in the poorhouses oftentimes were domestic workers who had lived with families and had taken care of family members, taken care of the house. When their owners or their employers had died, women were left with no place to go. And so they often had to migrate into the poorhouse. Women were also considered, had been nannies and seamstresses. So when women were in the poorhouse, many of them had come from jobs other than being a homemaker and a housewife for their own family. Some of the individuals who lived in the poorhouses were considered physically and mentally impaired. And that brought about many problems sometimes for the people who were enslaved. That by no means was the majority of the people. As you can see, in 1910, 17,000 people died in poorhouses due to tuberculosis. That was here in Kentucky. There were multiple statutes that governed how people either entered the poorhouse or how their payments occurred for them to live there. It was believed that persons were entitled to relief. Persons were often referred to, as I said, as paupers, but they were still expected to be able to be cared for. And a county fiscal board became the overseers of the financial arrangements with the poorhouses in each county. Fiscal court had the authority to provide and maintain a poorhouse or a poor farm to care for the poor. And I'll give some examples of how that occurred over the years here in the county in just a bit. People were thought to be feeble-minded, or they were labeled that way. And this is a definition that I found that described residents in the courthouse. They were called pauper idiots, epileptics, and harmless, incurable lunatics, not to be kept in an asylum, but returned to the several counties and delivered into the custody of friends, if they had any. If not, to the county judge, and he shall make arrangement for their keeping. And from what the records show, the people that lived in the poorhouses sometimes didn't even know if they had relatives, or their relatives could not take them in and provide a home for them. So the poorhouse was the option they had. These are some pictures of poorhouses, almshouses, infirmaries in Kentucky. The one on the lower left is Fayette County's poorhouse. The one on the right is Jefferson County. This one is from Davis County, which is Owensboro. And as you can see, there's a double picture here. The one on the left shows a room in the poorhouse. Rooms were usually fairly sparse, a bed, maybe a rack to hang clothes on, chair. Excuse me. This slide is the poorhouse in Allen County, which is Scottsville, and that's down in the south middle part of the state. This house was built in 1937. Now, I realize this is hard to read, but I'll do a little bit of translation at the bottom. French Tipton, who many of you who know the history of Madison County or know a little bit about history. French Tipton was an attorney and newspaper editor, and he took what seems to be notes, lots of notes, and much of his work is, maybe all of the work that has been found that this is archived in EKU's library. This was a document it was a one-page document that actually tells the beginning of the poorhouse in Madison. And his first note was in 1823. And at the bottom, there's a description about it. He stated that, that there was a paid committee to the poorhouse, and they had $1,500 for that building. The poorhouse received by the court to be built. There were two men, Higginson Grubbs and Henry Howard. A William Blackman was a receiver and was given $5,000 to be a receiver, and I'm assuming that was for a year. I'll talk about what the receiver was. In 1924, the court appropriated to the poorhouse $500, and there were several log buildings built to house people. Log houses or log buildings were very common in the early days, from what I've been able to read. And I'm trying to highlight it and enlarge it, and it's still very difficult to read. But it does give kind of a timeline of the early days. But the earliest record I've been able to find is 1823. Now, this I know you cannot read. The script, the cursive writing is very elaborate. And I have an enlarged copy up here that's laminated if later on somebody wants to look at it. But this is the deed for land sold by William Kelsey and his wife for a formal house, poorhouse to be built out of Union City. And it doesn't give the acreage, but it does give the post marker lines for the land. And it sold for $369.25. It's a rather large piece of land that was sold out of Union City. Everybody in here, I'm assuming, knows what Union City is. Is there anybody that doesn't know? You're from Union City, okay. Well, it's in the northeast section of Madison County. I kind of highlighted and circled up there where it's located. And this is a close-up of the heart of Union City back in that time. And the main road going up and down is Union City Road. It cuts right through the vertical or the up and vertical of the flag. The courthouse, I mean the county house actually faced that road. Back of it is considered no. A lot of people know about them because it had lots of people who lived on that. Sure. The only picture I've been able to find that was the original building, the upper house. And my best estimate that it was probably built sometime around it. It's archived at EKU, but there's no descriptor about it being the poorhouse new building. But when you look at the building now, it's still in existence. When you look at it now, the architecture is the same. The difficult slide to read, so I'll just kind of share what it is. There was a gentleman by the name of L.R. Roberts, and he petitioned the court to serve as keeper of the poorhouse or the Madison County Infirmary. And in his note here, he makes a statement that the place will be kept clean and sanitary condition for $3.24 per week for each inmate. All children 5 years of age or younger will be cared for free, and all of those 5 to 12 years of age will be half price. Don't know the date of this, cannot find the actual. On the funding, it gets, like I said, it gets kind of complicated over time. There was an article written by Ian Sumlin. He wrote about pauper idiots and lunatics in Kentucky. And every time I say those words, I sort of have a cringe up my spine about idiots and lunatics. But in 1792, there were provisions made in the state records for caring for persons of unsound mind. In 1852, Kentucky state legislature eliminated what was called a lunatic allowance and kept allowances for the idiots. There were no psychiatric testing, psychometric testing that were used to determine a person's mental status. So the determination of someone's mental status was always considered questionable. Eastern Lunatic Asylum, which came to be known as Eastern State Hospital, was opened in May 1, 1824. And prior to that, there was no institution for care again. Same. Okay. This is probably kind of what makes me cringe a little bit more. These were definitions that were presented in a compendium of common law in force in Kentucky, 1822. Idiots are persons of unsound minds from birth. Lunatics are those who has his reason impaired by some infirmity afterward. However, the word lunatic includes all persons who become incapable by any impairment of mind of conducting their own affairs. Pauper idiots. 1793, Kentucky legislature identified this as individuals of an unsound mind with an insufficient estate to support him or her. They were feeble-minded poor. In 1824, the legislature enacted the Pauper Idiot Pension Law. When the county paid one half the pension and the state paid the other half. The law provided that an individual be before the court and tried, that was the word, legislation, by a jury, and if adjudged to be an idiot or a lunatic, and a pauper, the court then certified to the fiscal court of the county, and also the state auditor, who shall issue his warrant or payment to the treasury or on the treasury. This set up a whole bit of conflict over people who were judged by a fiscal court as to who was eligible for payment. From 1840 to the early 1870s, there were various changes in these statutes. Change was made in the care of those deemed pauper lunatics, because asylums were becoming overcrowded. County circuit courts formed committees to receive $200 annually for the lunatics, committees of pauper idiots to receive $50 annually. It became such a, what I would call a travesty, because a lot of people formed committees and adopted people who were considered feeble-minded lunatics, and they made money off of it. They housed them in their homes or some place out in the community. People actually, I guess the best way I would describe it, kind of sold themselves to be judged that way so that they could get a little portion of the money. In 1873, legislation increased the annual allowance from $50 to $75. And this act also made it possible for individuals deemed to be paupers to be cared for in houses. As that, although the Act of March 28, 1872 provided for an allowance of $200 for the pauper lunatics, an Act of 1880 established a maximum of $75 for all pauper idiots, epileptics, and lunatics. 10 years later, in 1880, only slight changes were made to take care of the idiots, but no further allowance were to be granted. Its beneficiaries were less than 8 years of age, or at any time feebled in mind by epileptic fits. So as you can see here, when the state legislature mandated allowance. $55 was paid to the state, $20 was paid to the county court, which is the fiscal court, in which the idiot was to reside. This became known as the idiot's pension. Pauper idiot law was trying. The piece from the Richmond Climate newspaper, May 16, 1900. The poorhouse is for incurables as well as the aged. It's hard to read, I realize, but this is a ledger from fiscal court records on the budget for 1936, I think, 39. And the budget, the pauper pension, $3,000. Pauper idiots were $600. The pauper burials, $1,500. Pauper medical and medicines, $1,500. And then county infirmary in Union City, I think it was $4,000. Changed from one category to another within the fiscal court. They kind of moved funding around. In the pauper idiot claims, which you can see down in the second line, the amount is $100. Pauper burial and medicine allocated $500, hospital $500, and that transferred down to a different category where the court, the pauper pensions and accounts $500, the county infirmary $500. Not all paupers in Madison County lived in the poorhouse. Many of them lived out in private homes. Caretakers took care of them, received part of their pension. Y'all bear with me, I'm going to sit down. My evil's hurting. Staff at the poorhouses were known as the keepers, the superintendent, or custodian. Those were titles that repeated themselves in the fiscal court records and in newspapers. The keeper, who was the lead person, was considered the house manager. They were overseer of the care of the residents. They supervised the grounds, the farm, if they had a farm. The spouse of the keeper was most likely the one who helped take care of the residents. That person might have even had to help bathe and care for residents who were impaired and could not do for themselves. They were also responsible for cleaning the house, washing clothes, cooking meals, and they sought medical care for the residents if they needed. In my opinion, this is an awesome job for person to have, because this was a lot of work and a lot of demand on an individual. The person who went by receiver was considered, I guess, the financial manager for the business. They bought supplies, they paid for contract services. If there needed to be food bought and they ran a debt somewhere at some store for food items, then the receiver was the person who was responsible for paying that debt once it was accumulated. Names of keepers, receivers, other people who showed up in some of the records. Talked about Higginson Grubbs. He was one of the early keepers. When he passed away, his wife Phoebe was appointed to the position. Mr. Golden and James Golden went into that position. In 1884, you can see the keeper was John Hill. James Nolan was a receiver. The Nolans, there were several Nolans who served in various capacities with the courthouse. Dr. J.N. Harris was the first physician that actually provided services for the residents. He didn't live at the house, but apparently he made visits to the house and residents were taken to see him. In 1941, Miley Long was the keeper. And I thought this was interesting, is that he actually petitioned the fiscal court for some funds, had someone come in and help pay some residents who couldn't do that themselves. And a nurse, and I'm not sure what qualifications it was for a nurse, but this was the language that was actually in the record. The nurse was to be paid $10 a week to take care of the patient who was unable to care for him or herself. This is a photo that I was given about a keeper of the poorhouse in the mid-1915s, 1915 to 1920. Sober with his wife Nanny. They lived at the poorhouse. And on the right is a portion on an entry in the fiscal court where he was to be paid $1,000 for a year to be the keeper. And of course, living there, he got his room and board, plus the $1,000. And this man is the great-grandfather of this man. Some of you might recognize Todd Marbley. And I didn't know Todd had any association to anybody with the poorhouse until I was at a neighbor's house and she happened to tell him I was doing research on the poorhouse. And he said, my great-grandfather worked at the poorhouse. He had the photo, and then in the court record, fiscal court records, I found that entry about the amount his great-grandfather was paid. Keepers and superintendents, receivers, and others. In the mid-1940s, there were legal action brought against probably the man who had the longest record of serving as keeper in the poorhouse, and that was Mr. Jack Freeman. And there's quite a bit written about Mr. Freeman in the court records and in the newspaper. Also, at that time, Charles Wells was considered the receiver. The records in the fiscal court that I've been able to find sometimes are not very clear about exactly what they thought Mr. Freeman had done, that they brought action against him. There's a statement in there that they demanded recovery of all furniture that they believe he took from the poorhouse. And that Mr. Wells had taken some books and records from the poorhouse. Wells left the position. The fiscal court brought a legal action, an actual suit against Mr. Freeman. There was a jury trial, and from what I saw in a newspaper article, a jury absolved Mr. Freeman of all ill deeds. And he was later reappointed to the position of keeper, and he stayed as keeper for many years. I've not tracked how many total years he was keeper, but it seems he was there for a long time. And I think from what I've read, he served people in the poorhouse very well. His grandson is here tonight, and Jimmy came, and he'll maybe entertain some questions later on. But Jimmy has been very instrumental in sharing some of his memories about Poorhouse. Some other names, William Searcy, who actually in a little while you'll see us, you may be able to read a U.S. Census report of people who resided as a poorhouse during a particular time. Mr. Searcy, when he was, he shows census records being 33 years of age. At the time, he was a keeper of the poorhouse, which was pretty young. Jerry Nolan, James Nolan, Nolans in the early days had a lot of connection to the poorhouse, and I believe they're the Nolans who are part of the Nolan Road back of the poorhouse. And then Mary Kane, who is the mother of Jimmy Kane, she was the last one to hold the position as keeper. Pictures that I found from the archives. It was not uncommon apparently for people to go to the poorhouse and have a meal. This shows businessmen from the city who went out and I guess enjoyed a luncheon there. I actually had lunch with Richard Thomas, who some of you probably know, as he was once a CEO with Baptist here in Richmond, Baptist Hospital, and later became city manager. And he told me that he remembered in the late 1960s, early 70s, going with a group of people out to the poorhouse and having lunch. And he said it was wonderful food, and the thing he remembered the most were pies. They were absolutely delicious pies. He said, those women out there sure know how to cook well. The photo that Jimmy and his wife Brenda shared, that was, I think, in his mother's scrapbook, Mary Kane's scrapbook. And it was taken, it's dated May 2nd, 1956. And these are some businessmen who had come out to have lunch. And Mr. Freeman is there on the right where the arrow is pointing up to him. At that time, it's noted that there were 17 residents. I think they're referred to in that one as inmates, but there were 17 residents that lived there. And it's estimated that that house was built 85 years ago, which would have put it 1881. That's when it was built. I did my math right. I know this is hard to read, but this is the census report 1860. In 1860, they list 9 males, ages 85 to 4 years old. There's 12 females, ages 74 to 1 year old. And there's 1 female, age 18, who's identified as the last column is where they are listed as paupers, and they're in her, there's 1 person that's listed that, and apparently she's there with her mother, gathering it's her mother. There's a woman's name above hers that's the same as her. It's transcribed census from 1870, and there's 9 males, ages 78 to 2 years of age, 16 females, ages 75 to 2 years of age. In this census report, it does list where people from what origin is. And you can see kind of up near the top, there's two people whose home country or port of origin was Ireland. So two Irish immigrants was the house there. Down middle ways of that listing, there is a and I think it's a 7.5-year female who's listed as deceased. So at some point, she lived in the house but died at the time census records were taken, which is kind of interesting. The way it's shown. Oh, one of the things I forgot to mention in oh no, this is the 1940s, this one. In this one, there's a listing of two lodgers who were men, aged 75 and 70, and one female lodger, age 83. I'm not sure how they distinguished that. I don't know how that how they classified that in this particular census. There are 20 males, ages 70 to 39. There's two females, ages 72 to 50, and there's 6 Negroes listed. Now the question came up when Sharon Mitchell and I were looking at these slides last week. She was asking about the individuals who were identified as Negroes and were they segregated. And I didn't know, and I think I had missed this when I had read a document that was written by a woman, Mrs. Griggs, who did a sort of a history of Union City. She did a section on the poorhouse, and she did interviews with people who lived down there. And one of the people she interviewed has mentioned that there were people that were Negroes who lived in Negro cabins. And then that's all that was made in that statement. So apparently there was, according to this one person, segregation. This is the 1950 census. And I was surprised because I have a second cousin. The very last person listed here is a William Burns, who turned out to be my second cousin. I never knew about this man. Never knew this man had ever gone to the poorhouse. Anyone in my family poorhouse. What I think has happened with him, he had lived with his parents in Kingston, which is not far from where I grew up, but where my grandparents lived. And my grandmother's brother, George Washington Burns, is William Burns' father. And apparently when George Washington Burns and his wife Mary passed away, there was no place for William to go, is what I gathered. And so he didn't have a home and went to the poorhouse. I don't know when he left the poorhouse. I did find some documents where he eventually lived in Fayette County, and from Fayette County, he went to Falmouth, Kentucky, and he died there in 1978 and was buried there. So since I'm one of the oldest of my generation, there's really no one that I can talk to in the family that knows anything about how this man came to live. A lot of people in the community, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's newspaper articles from various sources that show or write about groups who did things for people with house. And this is one WPA Sewing Center. The very last part of this article says the Sewing Center also will provide shirts and overalls for the inmates of the Madison County Infirmary in Union City.
Infirmary and the courthouse are the same thing?
They are, yeah. And where that name changed, I don't know, because it's interchanged throughout the records. It's even interchanged throughout the physical court records. Sometimes it'll be listed as courthouse, sometimes it'll be listed as the Madison County Infirmary. Newspaper articles will do the same thing. They'll change. Early on, they had the initial listing, and then somehow it got changed from time to time as the infirmary. But I cannot tell you why it changed or how it came to be changed. And it changed again. The name changed again. I'll show you that just a little while. There's several articles, again, not several, but there are articles about churches who came to the poorhouse and brought items for people, brought clothing. It was real common at Christmas time for people to visit the poorhouse, and they brought clothing and items for the residents there, and brought toys for children, if children were there living at the time. There's different information about people who actually resided in the poorhouse. There's really no clear record, continuous record of people other than the census reports that show names. But this is about a resident who died. As you can see, it's an aged man by the name of Bills, no last name. And he was actually killed on the railroad track. He was walking down the track in a cut on a curve, and the engineer in charge of the train did not see him and couldn't stop in time. He was badly maimed and died almost immediately. Death notice that appeared in the Lexington Leader. Miss Becky Ann Simmons, age 70, inmate, County Infirmary at Union City, died at Petty Clay Infirmary at 11:30 Monday night. She had been admitted to the hospital Monday morning. Services were to be held at 4 o'clock today at the Union City Cemetery. There's a sort of a document or a historical document, I guess I would call it, that was written by a lady, Ms. Griggs, about Union City, and Teresa Lowe was kind enough to make a copy of it and give it to me. This lady actually interviewed people in Union City who had lived there for a long time and knew about the poorhouse. And this is just a couple of quotes out of that article. Sarah and Dummy, who were sisters, Shorty, Uncle Tom Grady, Peg Behrman, and Aunt Rhoda were the best known during the time I was growing up there in the 30s. That was the 1930s. We children were not always kind. As Tag and a partner plowed the land around the school, boys teased and took clods and laughed at them. Tag had to climb the fence and come to ask Miss Core to stop us. Miss Core was the teacher there, I guess. I'm assuming it's the teacher. At my young age, I knew that we were cruel. Shorty His sporty hat, called football, got in his head, always chose to walk to Union, sitting in the middle of the road, hoping he could hook a ride by holding on to the running board of a car if one passed. Now, I had a longtime friend who grew up at Union City, and she happens to remember Shorty. She talked about Shorty oftentimes would be out helping clean out fence rows. But he was a crippled man and used crutches to walk around on, but he would walk out and help clean out somebody's fence row and maybe earn a few dollars, or was given some other something for his labor. On Fonda Grave, there's a listing for Union City Cemetery, also known as the Madison County Infirmary Cemetery, located in Union City between the site of the old courthouse on Melon Road and the backside of a mobile home park which fronts Union City Road. And there are 11, at that listing, there were 11 memorials for now. Brings a lot of question on, because there's no formal identified cemetery in Union City. My husband and my friend Diana Allen and I walked on some property down there trying to identify what we thought might be graves. Couldn't find them. In the Union City history that Ms. Griggs wrote, a lady told her that the Union City Cemetery was near a cedar thicket. Jimmy's going, well, it might have been near the thicket we weren't at, because we couldn't find any markers or any place. She said there were actually stone markers. We couldn't find any when we walked it.
There were.
Jimmy says there were. And there's another Jimmy here, Jimmy Allen. And I know Jimmy Allen and Jimmy, two Jimmys, have tried to identify maybe the cemetery.
We thought maybe we had found where the graves, been where the ground, some, but no markers.
No markers. Well, there's another interesting, I'll give you show you a little bit about George Skinner, who's the last person here. There are some obituaries of people that were identified as being buried there, and there's also some death certificates listed. It's also interesting that William Thomas Nolan is shown to be buried there, and thinking that's the Nolan Road, which ran behind the cemetery, ran behind the courthouse. That is named after Mr. Nolan. This is one of several of the unknowns. This is the death certificate of George Berryman, who lived there. And if you're familiar with death certificates done in a genealogy of your family or anybody, usually you try to look for every bit of information about a person on the death certificate. You'll notice down middle ways on the left side, it asks for information about birthplace, father's name, father's living, place of living, mother's maiden name, where she was from, her birthplace. It says that there's no source of information for him. Don't know where he came from. He died of carcinoma of the stomach, and it also identifies that he was buried at the cemetery in Union City. George Skinner, who was also identified to be buried at the Union City Cemetery. This is his obituary. George Skinner, age 60, for several years, a resident of the county infirmary at Union City, died at the Patty Clay Infirmary, so on and so forth. Funeral services were conducted at the grave at Union City. This slide comes from Joe Swelsness. He posted this on a Facebook thread that I started reading several years ago from Mr. Shannon's posting. So if you look in the kind of the left side, you'll see the former Madison County Infirmary Poorhouse. You'll see the aerial view of where it's located. And if you come down, those are new houses that are now part of what's considered West Haven subdivision, but that arrow points to a section which we think is the location of the cemetery because it looks like sunken graves. When we went out, when I say we went out to look around the neighborhood, try to locate the cemetery. We could see in the distance a fenced off section of land behind the house. And the grass had grown really high. It didn't look like it had been mowed, but it was all fenced off. And I suspect that's where the cemetery was located. But we couldn't access it without going across other owners' property. So we didn't go to the trailer park there in the front, or at the bottom of the page. I think it's gone now. And something else is built in there. But I can't tell you that's where the cemetery is located, but that's where I suspect it is because it looks like ground. But I counted right. I counted 40 areas there where that ground appears to be kind of dug up for a casket, box of some sort of grave. This is a court record of where there was a change with the poorhouse. It was changed to be called Rest Haven. And this occurred in 1956. There was a lot going on in 1956 in the county. There was an effort to actually build a home for the aged in 1956. And the state offices who started really looking at homes for what was considered the poorhouse, but homes for the aged, really got to be more involved with county facilities. And so they started mandating certain things to be taken place. They mandated what was to be present in the home, how people were supposed to be cared for, and for a name change other than the poorhouse. And since the infirmary didn't have any kind of legal status, somebody had to choose a name. And Mr. Freeman chose the name. He chose West Haven. So this is a copy of the document that actually made it official fiscal court records. And it's very lengthy. Again, it had to be actually looked at by the state auditors, and who audited those homes had to be given approval for that to be. Again, this is just part of fiscal court record that actually shows where the county attorney, who was Salem Moody at that time, made it official in the court rulings that the Department of Economic Security had approved the name change and that the name would be then known as Rest Haven. And this is a negative of photos. I could not find the photos. There were 6 or 8 negatives that are part of document at the EKU archives. Apparently somebody from the Richmond newspaper had gone out and snapped a bunch of pictures, and those negatives were turned over to archives at the library. This, I'm going to go through some requests to and by the fiscal court in relationship to the courthouse, because it shows how things were supposedly taken care of. In 56, September 4th, 1956, a deep freeze to be purchased for the county infirmary. And report back. Now you're going to see that several things got sent to the committees. And I actually did find in one document where there was a poorhouse committee. So they made decisions oftentimes about what could take place or what could be done in the poorhouse. November 7th, 1956, Magistrate Ed Wayman reports that various undertakers or funeral home directors in the county have stated they could no longer bury adult paupers for $50 or a pauper child for $25. Motion brought by Mr. Wayman in court. They ordered the increase for the pauper burials to $75 for adults and $40 for children. January 2nd, 1957, the county infirmary, which is now known as Rest Haven, there's a mention of the graveyard. Jack Freeman, keeper, asked permission to clear the graveyard at the county infirmary. Matter was referred to the county infirmary committee. Now, I don't know what clear the graveyard means. I'm assuming that it might have been mowing the graveyard, but I don't know for a fact.
They cut down all the trees except one big cedar, and it was this big. So that's what happened.
Did you all hear that? Okay. Jimmy said they cut down all the cedar, all the trees around one big cedar tree. Is that correct, Jim?
Correct.
So that's what meant clearing the cemetery. July 2nd, 1957, Jack Freeman requested the purchase of a new cooking stove. Motion was made and approved to purchase a new cooking stove. These stoves get to be interesting, which you'll see again.
It was a coal stove, by the way.
That one was cold. I figured it was, because we get a check. Well, we got another stove request coming up. September 20th, 1956, Rest Haven water from Waco District. The judge ordered the county clerk to advertise bids for the running and laying in a water line from the water meter at the road to Rest Haven. Court revisited the subject again June 6, 1967, and again June 5th, 1967. August 1967. So they started the process in 1965, and 2 years later they got water. Did they have a well before that, Jimmy? He's talking. Jimmy, before they got the water line, what was the source of water?
Cistern.
Cistern.
Yep. And sometimes they had to buy one. Cistern.
Mid-1960s, the fiscal court pursued building a home for the aged on the county property at the intersection of US 25 and 421. Does that ring a bell with anybody now? Property, anybody know? What? There's discussion now about being a new dog shelter, animal shelter on that property. I'm sorry? It is, but that's where this property, I think, was located at the time. The court continued action pending study by George William Robbins, county attorney, as to the proposal. June 7th, 1966, again identified as Rest Haven, representative for the Kentucky Department of Economic Security states the department is responsible for licensing such homes. License must be renewed by July 1, 1966, and the following must be corrected. Okay, this is the actual document for the fiscal court records. Tabletop and kitchen should be corrected. I don't know what that means. I'm assuming replaced maybe, but it says it's to be corrected. Chipped enamelware is present. Walls need painting and repairing. Floor covering needs in some rooms. And bed coverings and furniture needs replacing. And the license, the new license says that Mr. Freeman, the present caretaker, be employed. In other words, he to be, and this needs to be done in order for them to license the facility. So in 1968, the Rest Haven, or the county home as it was identified in the records, an architect comes from, or comes to the house, to the Rest Haven house, and says it's in bad state of repair. Now, this architect is also in the fiscal records identified as the architect for a home in Garrett County. So Garrett County had some sort of a poorhouse at that time. And so this architect had gone to Garrett County, and then he comes to Madison County. He states that there needs to be major repairs to the present Rest Haven building. If not, a new one needs to be built. And if a new one was to be built, then the county would pursue FHA financing. No action was taken at that time. And then May 29, 1969, report to the court, new chairs had been furnished to Rest Haven and an urgent need for floor covering in the kitchen. Motion carried to replace the floor covering. This floor covering has been now been going on for several years. The need for floor covering. In 1969, the county property in Terrell says they need to take steps to sell the property. This was the previous mentioned property for the home for the aged. So, in 1970, Rest Haven State Health Authorities advises it is necessary to install a sprinkler system if it's going to qualify as a home for the aged. Court appointed a committee. Lots of committees here. Wanted a committee to meet with state authorities about the situation. 1970, State will approve the license for another year if certain type of a fire door and a certain type of glass be installed. The estimated cost, $600. Motion carried. Committee appointed to proceed. I don't know how anything got done without a committee being involved. November 4th, 1970, cook stove. Another cook stove involved. A request is made for a new cook stove. Motion carried. Court appointed a committee of R.C. Boggs, Jeanette Bogey, Ferris Parks, and house matron Mrs. Mary Kane to purchase the stove. This is the first time a woman name is mentioned in any records that I could find about us being given permission for anything to be done in relationship to the facility. Also, the committee was directed to look into the heater problem at the facility. They did get the cook stove, but as a part of that, Mr. Freeman, the custodian, pays the difference in the electric bill from the previous monthly average and expense incurred by the use of the electric cook stove. Motion carried. This goes through the closure, the move to close the poorhouse. Goes from 1971, where Mrs. Kane is involved. Mr. Freeman passes away. Ms. Kane, Mary Kane, his daughter, assumes responsibility for running it. She actually proceeds to ask the fiscal court to appoint her as matron. There goes through several actions around things with insurance coverage, whether or not insurance will be provided to cover. And eventually, the state says that the home needs to be closed. And this is actually where the state does recommend that closure in September 1971. The county decides to lease the land, and they lease it to people on the land. From best I can tell, over the time, people who leased the land grazed cattle on it. The house was left in a state of disrepair. Essentially, the property was ruined. It was decided the fiscal court would put it up for sale, and a couple by the name of Parker were the people who originally bought the property. And this is the tract of land, the full tract of land that became the subdivision. And the poorhouse, the rest haven, is located in the second plot, number 4. You can see the little drawing back toward Nolan Road that shows where it's located. Unknowns, records of residence, what brought them to the home, if living, where they went on leaving the poorhouse, rest haven. Unknown exactly about the cemetery. Records of finance, there's none that I've been able to find other than what appears in the court records. Just some memories of people who visited the poorhouse. Margaret Souters went there as a Burke College student, visited. She guessed it was about 1961. Thought it was interesting that, people had a place to live. Other comments? Somebody remembered that Jack Henry chewed tobacco and walked up to the store often. Minnie, a resident, cooked at the poorhouse and had red hair. The Freemans were good to the people, thought they, the residents, ate good. And I believe this comment came from Jimmy. The last person to leave was an elderly man. I'm sorry.
Speak a word in English.
Says, don't make me go. These are three key people who helped me a lot through the later years research. Diana Allen and the two Jimmys. Jimmy outstanding, Jimmy King, seated to the right. I got connected through Judge Klaus, and he sent me quite a lengthy text, which I was very appreciative of. But he talks about, he remembered going to the poorhouse after it had been closed, and what the state of repair on essentially the building and that it was in shambles. He said that he remembers discussions concerning the poorhouse. He thought it was in a good location. A school was located there, and people did not seem to be fearful of the residents. This is what it looks like today. And the present owners are here. Dean. I'm sorry, I cannot get them. They're here. It's a beautiful facility. It's gone through different states of renovation, but it from the outside is an absolute gorgeous building. And the land, the property around it has been well cared for. And it's certainly a historic treasure in my opinion. This is one of the original posts to the entry. There's two of them. One is more deteriorated than the other. But as you can see, there's 149 years of service to some of the county's most needy, most vulnerable people. And these are the wonderful people who helped me collect a lot of research over time. They've really been very beneficial in providing information, sending me documents, and helping me do some tracing. I have a lot more information than I've shared with you tonight, but this is essentially a bird's eye view.